Well, I guess I would still have to say that my favorite are the Princeton books. Those books are right behind me here. Those two Princeton volumes. This is the bicentennial year of Princeton Seminary. It was founded 200 years ago, 2012, 200 years ago, 1812. So various things are happening now to celebrate that bicentennial. My Princeton history has been, I think, the books that I have written that have gained the most attention, and I keep getting letters and phone calls and many different expressions of interest and appreciation for those books. I just heard the other day from a Covenant graduate, actually, who did his PhD studies at Trinity with John Woodbridge. He wrote on Warfield. His book has now been published. And he has been able, with some other Princeton scholars that write about what we call Old Princeton Seminary, to include that in the Evangelical Theological Society program for next year. There'll be a Old Princeton study group that will meet along with many other groups that meet at ETS. And he was writing to say he would like for me to be there and to thank me for these Princeton volumes, which he said really he felt had a lot to do with creating this kind of groundswell of interest among newer scholars in the history of Old Princeton. So many books coming out, Warfield, Hodge, and different aspects of the Old Princeton history. Personally, Princeton books are important. My book on John Bunyan was a kind of labor of love because I grew up with Pilgrim's Progress and always loved that story and used it often in sermon illustrations, and wanted one day to kind of put together something that would reflect the teaching and the influence of John Bunyan. I have a book coming out in the spring this year, published by Banner of Truth, like the Princeton volumes, that will be a one-volume history of the old Columbia Seminary. Columbia Seminary was the southern counterpart to Princeton Seminary. And Columbia Seminary for 100 years was in Columbia, South Carolina. That's why it's called Columbia Seminary. Even though today it's in Decatur, Georgia, it's still called Columbia Seminary because of the beginnings of that seminary. Princeton was reorganized in 1929. That began to open Princeton up to diverse influences. Columbia Seminary moved from Columbia, South Carolina to Decatur, Georgia about the same time. So Old Columbia and Old Princeton have a lot in common. And I had written the history of the First Presbyterian Church in Columbia, South Carolina, the bicentennial history of that church. The bicentennial took place in 1994. And that church was the mother church of Columbia Seminary. Sinclair Ferguson is now the pastor of First Presbyterian Columbia, and very much involved, of course, with Banner of Truth. So I have submitted that book. It will be published. I've worked on a second book, which I've finished, and Banner of Truth will look at this now and consider publishing it as well, a kind of follow-up to the Columbia Seminary book on the life and writings of a man named William Childs Robinson, product of the old seminary, but he taught at the seminary in Georgia for over 40 years and was a great pastor, teacher, Christian leader, and something of the last of the old Columbians at the new Columbia Seminary. William Childs Robinson was the teacher of a majority of the early leaders in the PCA. These were men that went to Columbia Seminary, studied under Dr. Robbie, as they called him, loved him, his influence, his love for Reformed theology, his love for preaching, his love for the church really impacted these men. Interestingly, Dr. Robinson did not become PCA. He remained in what was called the Southern Presbyterian Church. He just could not bring himself to leave that old historic church. But his influence was very dominant, I would say, more than anybody else's, in setting the theological direction of the PCA. So, a couple of things I'm doing. Enjoy continuing to write and do research. Should say, with the wonderful help of Wayne Sparkman, it's great to have the archives here of the PCA, the Historical Center, and Wayne Sparkman, who is a zealous researcher. He finds anything I need to know.